If you will, open your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 6. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 is where we will spend the first few moments. I know that yesterday some people were able to make it out, and I tortured them thoroughly, so my apologies to those who were tortured. And I had asked for 2.5 hours, and I took 3 hours yesterday, which is the longest I've ever spoken, ever. Brittany told me in all the years that she's known me, she's never known me to speak that much. So I'm all out of my words. I have used them all for the month, apparently. That's how I feel. So we're going to keep it very short, very brief. I had mentioned to someone what I was planning to talk, and he's like, "Oh, are you planning to go into all these other areas?" I said, "No, we're going to keep it rather simple today." Here in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul asks what is a rhetorical question, which, if you're reading through the New Testament, it kind of comes as a shock because it seems like the first time it's mentioned. How Paul can so easily throw off rhetorical questions that actually give new information, I haven't quite figured out, but he's really good at it. So in the context of the second half of chapter 6, he's dealing with sexual purity. And he mentions the idea earlier, back in verse 16, that if you're joined with a prostitute, you become one flesh with them. And to highlight how absurd that is, not how absurd the possibility of, but why you would do it, he points out this question here in verse 19. He says, "Do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own? For you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body." This is, if you have the old King James or the old American Standard, you would see that this is the singular you, that you individually, your body, your personal body, is the temple of God. Now, this is the part where we could easily dive into the Old Testament and talk about all the purity that went around with the old tabernacle and with the temple. You know, that this, as you get into the laws of what was to be done for the temple, you had Levites who would be armed with swords, who were ordered to kill anybody who wasn't supposed to be in the temple grounds and came into the temple grounds, because purity was absolutely necessity. Some of the obscure laws from the book of Leviticus, you think, why would those ever be important? And God references back to the fact that if you are going to draw near me, you must revere me as being holy. The temple was supposed to be a place that was the nearest you can get to God. And so when Paul says, "Do you not know that your bodies are the temple of God?" there's a care and concern that we need to take towards ourselves and how we present our bodies, how we present our temples before God. As you go over into 1 Corinthians chapter 3, a couple chapters back, Paul gets into the topic of building upon the foundation of the gospel. And so he makes the point earlier on, first couple verses, that Paul is really nothing, Apollos is really nothing, because Paul planted and Apollos watered, and in verse 6 it was God who gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. And then he makes the point there in verse 9 that we are God's fellow workers, and you are God's field and God's building. And then from this topic of a building, he then talks about, here in verse 10, that according to God's, or the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid the foundation, and someone else has built upon it. But let each one take care how he builds upon it. For no one can lay a foundation other than that which has been laid, which is Christ Jesus. Now if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will be manifest in the day it will be disclosed, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each person has done. If the work that anyone has built upon the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. And if anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. And then again, he has this rhetorical question in verse 16. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy you, for God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. And again, if you're reading from the King James or from the Old American Standard, you'll realize that this is the plural you. And so we have a change from chapter 6, where he talks about you, your individual body as a temple, to the shift here in chapter 3, which is we. We as a church are God's temple. And then you get into a whole other topic of not just the purity that he describes in chapter 6, but how you build upon it. There is a rather large section of Exodus that is given over to the construction of the first temple. And then there's a large section given over in Samuel, over to the construction of the temple itself. And then there's a large section given over in Chronicles of David's preparation for the temple, and then another large section in Chronicles given over to the construction of Solomon's temple. And then you have also Ezra and Nehemiah that go into the construction of the new temple. There's a whole lot of construction of temples in the Old Testament. There's a lot of it. And as you read through the Bible, those are kind of the sections that we get bogged down on and thinking, maybe I won't read through the Bible in a year, this year, because we get kind of bored with all that construction talk. And you wonder, why is it that I have to read it in Exodus? And why do I have to read it again in Samuel? And why do I have to read it again as we get over into Chronicles? And then after all of that, why Ezra and Nehemiah? Why is this important? Why do I care what the materials were, or how they built it, or who was the construction artist? Why do I care about all of this? If I'm not going to go to the temple, if I'm never going to see the tabernacle, why is that important? God takes great care on how his people build on his temple. That was clear from the very beginning. God didn't say, well, just erect any old tabernacle for me and I'll be fine with it. He says, this is exactly how I want it done. And he shows them the pattern in which they're to follow. And then whenever Solomon builds, David spends years prepping, getting all the cedars, getting all the gold, getting the silver and the bronze, all that's needed. And then Solomon gets the very best of the carpenters and spends 12 years constructing the temple. And the estimates of just the raw materials of what it was worth range in the billions of dollars. It was important for them to build something that was appropriate for God. And so when Paul says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 that, first off, understand in verse 11 that you cannot lay a foundation other than that which has been laid. If you build on something other than Jesus Christ, then it's not a temple to God. It's not anything. But he tells us in verse 10 that take care how you build upon it. And that's where we are today. We are commissioned by God to be temple builders. And there's kind of two things I just want to look at. One's chapter 6. How do you present yourself before God? And the second one is chapter 3. How do we as a collective build God's temple? That's our hope for not just this coming year. That's not just our hope that come November 1st, whenever we get into a location, that we're going to erect a really nice location, but that we actually produce for God. So the question is, what kind of builders are you? You give kids tasks. You give them the same task on different days, and you see that not every kid is going to approach every task the same way. You give adults the same task, and you'll find the same thing. For those who have ever built a house, or those who have ever bought a car, if you ever buy a car, and you go and you look for a car, you realize that not every car manufacturer decides to make the same choices. Some may choose Ford. I don't know why, John, but some people choose Ford. Some people choose American-made because they believe in American-made. Some choose Japanese because, well, they're rarely precise. Some choose Korean because, well, they're rather cheap and hopefully still pretty well made. We have all those things that go into car manufacturing. If you were to build a house, you would go talk to a variety of builders to find which one was going to build the kind of style or the type of code that is required. And it comes to us as humans, we end up tending to be different types of builders. I just want to kind of give 5 different types of builders that we tend to be, and really ask ourselves the question, where are we, and what kind of builder ought we to be? The first one is the preoccupied builder. If you ever send your kids off to do some tasks, or if you work at a workplace and you have other coworkers, you'll find a lot of preoccupied builders. People who, they're there, but that's not really what they want to do. And they're kind of preoccupied with other stuff in their life. And, as soon as they have some free time, they're going to be on their phone, they're going to be on their computer, taking care of what they really want to do. And as soon as they get off work, they're out the door. No matter what, they're going to be gone because they punched out and you can't ask them to stay any longer. They're preoccupied. And as Christians, we find the same thing. We find that there are people who, as soon as amen said, we're going to be gone, we're going to be out the door. If I have other things in my life that are slightly more pressing, then I may or may not make it to services. Those are preoccupied. Look at Matthew chapter 8. We're going to be flipping back and forth between 1 Corinthians and Matthew. So if you have a spare ribbon, you can stash one in 1 Corinthians. In Matthew chapter 8, we get into one of the harder sayings of Jesus, down around verse 21 and down to verse 22. So we often go to the passage here in verse 20, where Jesus says that foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And then in verse 21 and verse 22, you have two of the really hard teachings of Jesus that most people kind of scratch their heads at and go, why would Jesus say that? One of them here in verse 21 is one of the disciples came to him and said, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. Context, verse 18, Jesus said to the crowd, or gave orders to the crowd for them to go to the other side from where they were. So they're here, and they're called to go to the other side. And one scribe in verse 19 says, I will follow you wherever you go. And then you have the other one in verse 21 who says, let me first go bury my father. That seems really reasonable. That seems like the logical thing to do. Yes, I will go to the other side with you. Just let me take care of this funeral procession first. It's my father. It's his burial. It's not like it's going to happen 6 months from now. It's a one-time deal. We're going to bury him, and then we'll be done with it for a while. And Jesus says, leave the dead to bury the dead. Follow me. And that seems so harsh. It seems so uncaring or not understanding of what's going on. What we have is God, who has called these people very specifically to do something. What would cause them to not follow? Here's a person who's preoccupied with what he believes at this point in time to be something more important. And Jesus says, let the dead bury their own dead. Follow me. And we sometimes tend to be preoccupied in our building. And if you were having someone to build your house, you probably don't want them to be preoccupied whenever they're building things like structural supports. Just guessing. You want someone who's focused on the task at hand, who finds that important. If you're going to be going in flight, you don't want someone who's preoccupied while they go over all the pre-flight checks. You want them to have thoroughly gone over all of those things. And then if Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 to take care how you build, being preoccupied is probably one of those things we probably don't want to be. Another one is a manic depressant builder. I don't know if you've been around people who tend to be somewhat manic depressant. They're really on a task and they're very, very zealous for a little while, and then butterflies come around or something else happens in life that they're really excited about this for a very short time period, and then they get interested in something else. And sometimes we as Christians do that. In Matthew chapter 6, and there in verse 33, Jesus says, seek first God's kingdom. Don't let other things become distractions later on. Have a zeal and work to fan that flame. We'll get those words out. I've used all my other words up. But the idea of being zealous, but being zealous only for a season, or caring, but only caring for a short amount of time. And sometimes we see people like this where they'll come in and they'll be on fire for a couple months. And then they kind of dwindle for a little while. And then all of a sudden they're back at it again for a little while. And they kind of find other things that are more important in life. And then they're going to be back at it again. But Paul tells Timothy to be in season and out of season, to always be on fire. And that's what we're looking for. And if you had a builder who was making something for you, and every 6 months they just kind of knocked off for 6 months and said, well, I have other things that just seem a lot more important, and then they come back and build for a little while, you would get frustrated with that. If you go over to 2 Samuel chapter 24. 2 Samuel chapter 24. I have to be careful with this one since Brittany is sitting right next to me, but Brittany is going to be the economic builder. Not actually in her work towards God, but she would rather buy 5 $1 brooms than buy 1 $5 broom and have to go back and forth to the Dollar General all the time. We appreciate people who enjoy economy and like to get a good bargain on things. But sometimes we as Christians, we like to be people who want the most bang for our buck. We don't want our work to cost us very much. I want to work, but as long as it doesn't really require too much out of me. And if I can get a bargain, I'm going to like that bargain. And here in 2 Samuel, David takes a census at the end of 2 Samuel. And the Lord gives him a choice whenever he repents. What do you want? And so he gives him 3 choices, and David chooses to fall into the hands of God because he knows that God is merciful. And then here at the end, David goes to build an altar to God. And he goes to Araunah. Araunah is a person who has a threshing floor. And here in verse 23, or verse 22, Araunah said to David, "Let the Lord my king take and offer up what seems good to him. Here are the oxen for the burnt offering, and the threshing sledges, and the yokes of the oxen, and for the wood. All this, O king, Araunah gives to the king." And then Araunah said to the king, "May the Lord accept you." Now, there is a bargain for the century. I'm going to make an offering to God, and someone comes along and says, have the threshing floor, have the oxen, have the yoke for the oxen, have the threshing sledge. Everything's right there. It's just there for you to offer. And then verse 24, but the king says to Araunah, "No, but I will buy it from you for a price. For I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing." So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. And if you look at your footnote, it's one shekel is about 50 grams, or 11 grams rather, and he bought it for 50. That's quite a heft of silver. It's quite a price that he paid. But the point is I want to make, or that David makes here, is I'm not going to offer burnt offerings to God that cost me nothing. We like to sometimes be economic, and we're going to offer to God, we're going to build, we're going to work, but I don't want it to cost me a whole lot. If I got extra time, if I got spare energy, if it's already going to fit into my schedule, then sure. But David says he wasn't going to offer to God anything that didn't cost him something. Now, part of being a sacrifice was actually going to be a sacrifice. And you consider how people who built on God's temple, whether it be David, who collected gold and commissioned all the cedar from Lebanon, or Solomon, who poured a lot more gold, or as you get the New Testament and you get into God's temple for the New Testament, what it cost the apostles to be builders of the temple, what it cost Aquila and Priscilla, what it cost Stephen or even Stephen's family for him to be someone who stood up and to preach the gospel, what it cost regular Christians on a regular basis to just be Christians and to share their faith. It was going to cost them something. I don't know how about you guys, but if you have a house that is going to hold a roof over your kid's head, I don't know if I want to be the most economic thing ever made. A little bit of quality, a little bit of standard good material, probably about the right thing for my family. And if that's what I want from my family, what do you think that God desires for his temple? If you go over to Matthew chapter 25, so we have the preoccupied builder, we have the manic depressant builder, we have the economy builder. We also have the absent builder. In Matthew chapter 25 is the parable and is given over of the talents. A talent being a rather large sum of money. The master goes away and he leaves 5 talents with one servant. He leaves 2 talents with another servant. And he leaves 1 talent with one servant. And in verse 22, after he comes back and he collects from the 5-talent servant and the 2-talent servant, in verse 22, he who had received, verse 23, the master said, verse 24, we'll get there eventually. Verse 24, he who had received the 1 talent came forward saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scatter no seed. So I was afraid. And I went and I hid your talent in the ground. And here, you have what is yours. But the master said to him, You wicked and lazy or slothful servant, you knew that I reaped where I had not sown, and I gathered where I had scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with a banker, and then at my coming I should have received what was mine with interest. And so take from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has will be given more, and he who has, so that he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast this worthless servant into outer darkness, into a place where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. God gives this as an analogy for himself. Himself as being a hard master who requires more than what is given. Oftentimes, here is a man who, for the entire time that his master was gone, he didn't lose anything, but he didn't do anything with it. He was commissioned to build God's treasury, his storehouses, if you will, and he was just absent in his work. He just didn't do anything. And note what he says. He calls him a slothful servant. If you put yourself in this man's shoes, if you were given over this amount of money, and it's not a small amount. A talent is a rather large amount of money. It's about 20 years worth of wages. If somebody hands over to you what is equivalent to your 20-year salary and says, take care of it. It would seem right to you to say, I gave you back exactly what you left with me. Here's all those 20 years worth of wages. I've done great. And he calls them lazy. And then in verse 30, he says, cast him out into outer darkness, into a place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Sometimes we get very afraid of what if we do our job wrong of building, that we don't build at all, and that we barely talk to anybody, we don't invite people, that we don't shine our light forth. We show up and we retain what God has given us, and we present ourselves only to God, just us, and hope that God is going to be acceptable of that, or accepting of that. And we become the absent builder. But there's one last one I want to talk about. This is, I just give 5. You can probably make a whole other list. But I want to talk about the perfectionist. These are the people who in life have built the Taj Mahal, who built Mont St. Michael's. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Mont St. Michael's. It's a castle that's on a small island off the northern coast of France. It is really cool that as the tide comes in, it becomes a moat in the ocean, or the ocean becomes a moat around it. When the tide goes out, you can walk in, but it's one of the coolest places. The Eiffel Tower, St. Peter's Cathedral, those were all built by perfectionists. They're not the economy builders who show up for a little while and use just the barest necessities. Solomon in God's temple was a perfectionist. Everything coated inside and outside with gold. The best of the materials, as large as you can make it, as big as it can be. Precise down to the very smallest of minute details. And the question comes up for us, what kind of builders ought we to be? Or maybe more even precise than that, what kind of builders does God deserve? Consider what he required of the Israelites. He required their first fruits. He required the firstborn, all that opened the womb, from animal or from man. And you had to buy back your firstborn from God. He required the very best of all the sacrifices, not just any old animal, but the right one. Whenever you build your personal lives or your bodies as the temple of God, what kind of life have you made for yourself, for God to dwell in you? What kind of builder have you been of your own personal life? When it comes to God's temple as a collective, how have you worked in God's field? How have you built? Because Paul tells us very, very detailed there to be careful how you build. It's not if you build, but be careful how you build. And so that's my simple question for us today. If we have been commissioned to be builders, how have you built? Both personally and collectively. What kind of person have you been? If there's anything we can do for you, if any prayers we can offer, any encouragement, let us know as we sing.